Often referred to as the Hammer of the Scots, King Edward I was one of the most powerful and divisive rulers in England. He was born in 1239, governed from 1272 until his death in 1307, and was renowned for his judicial reforms and military might. Edward's ambition characterized his reign: to create a lasting legacy for England and its surrounding regions by bringing his kingdom together and growing it. From his violent wars against the Scots to his timeless monuments of love, Edward I's life is a story of aspiration, strife, and remarkable impact. Continue to observe, discover 8 amazing facts about William Wallace and King Edward III. 1. The Hammer of the Scots. Edward I was known as the Hammer of the Scots because of his unrelenting wars against Scotland. His military actions in Scotland were a component of his greater plan to rule Britain. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland passed away, leaving Scotland without a clear heir. Edward seized the chance to establish his dominance over the Scottish throne. However, he encountered strong opposition to his proposals. Here comes one of Scotland's greatest heroes, William Wallace. Wallace led a Scottish uprising against Edward's rule in 1297, which ended in a bloody conflict. The Battle of the Stirling Bridge is the name of this conflict. Wallace's army defeated the English in a stunning fashion. Edward's aspirations were severely damaged by this fight, and Wallace soon came to represent Scottish opposition. William Wallace's name is still prominent in Scottish and English history. Edward, though, was committed to putting an end to the uprising. Edward marched a sizable army north to defeat in 1298, a year after the Battle of the Stirling Bridge, Wallace at the Falkirk Battle. Edward's formidable longbowmen and superior military strategies secured him this victory. The Scots persisted in their resistance after the victory, and William Wallace eluded capture for many years. In 1305, once Wallace was eventually betrayed and taken prisoner, Edward had him mercilessly put to death. This severe treatment made it very evident that disobedience to the English monarchy would not be accepted. Wallace's passing, regrettably for Edward I, did not signal the end of Scottish opposition. Following Edward's passing, Robert the Bruce carried on the fight and ultimately secured Scottish independence. Despite the failure of his attempts to subjugate Scotland, Edward's reputation as the Hammer of Scots endures because of his military prowess, aims at defeating the Scots. 2. The Crusades and Edward set out on a quest prior to ascending to the throne that would further cement his reputation as a warrior king. Years before he became known as the Hammer of the Scots, in 1270, he took taking part in one of the last campaigns in the Holy Land, the Ninth Crusade. European Christians started a series of religious conflicts known as the Crusades, with the intention of freeing Jerusalem and other holy places from Muslim rule. Edward's participation in the Crusades proved his strong religious convictions and ambition to become well known as a champion of Christianity. Along with other European leaders, he led a small group of English knights to the Holy Land to drive out forces of Muslims. But at this point, the Crusade effort had slowed considerably, and the Ninth Crusade eventually failed to accomplish its goals. Edward survived an assassination attempt while he was in the Holy Land. A Muslim. An assassin entered his camp and used a poisoned blade to stab him. Even though the cut was severe, Edward was able to repel his assailant and survive the poisoning, albeit it took him a long time to heal. Edward's reputation as a daring warrior was only strengthened by this near-death experience. Even though the Ninth Crusade's overarching objectives were not met, Edward's involvement strengthened his reputation as a monarch prepared to defend his people and his faith. His subsequent military operations were also impacted by his time in the Holy Land, especially his ruthless strategies in Scotland and Wales. The Barons' conflict with Edward I. External battles were not the only events that distinguished Edward's rule. Significant obstacles came from within his empire as well. In the early years of his rule, Edward had to deal with the perilous baronial political waters. During the reign of Edward's father, Henry III, the English barons were strong landowners who had a history of opposing royal authority. The barons staged several uprisings against the monarchy. These conflicts were passed on to Edward, and at first sought to cooperate with the barons. Nevertheless, his harsh taxing measures and aggressive military strategies damaged his rapport with them. The Second Barons' War, which began during his father's rule and lasted for a while, was one of the most famous battles, into the early years of Edward's reign. Simon de Montfort, a dynamic nobleman who aimed to curtail royal power and defend the rights of the people, led the baronial resistance. Barons. During the battle, de Montfort caught Edward, but Edward managed to break free, regroup, and defeat de Montfort in the Battle of Evesham in 1265. This triumph cemented Edward's dominance and signaled the end of the Second Barons' War. Despite his victory, Edward was aware that he couldn't govern without the backing of the barons. By enacting legislative changes that placated the barons and reinforced royal authority, he sought to improve the monarchy's relationship with the nobility. Power. Even though tensions between the barons and the crown would reappear in subsequent reigns, his capacity to handle internal strife was essential to his lengthy rule. Fourth, Prince Llywelyn's defeat and the conqueror of Wales. The conquest of Wales stands as one of Edward's greatest military triumphs. When Prince Llywelyn ap Gruffudd continued to rule Wales as an independent principality after Edward came to the throne in 1272. Edward was adamant about bringing Wales under English rule, notwithstanding Llywelyn's resistance to English encroachment on Welsh territory. Edward began his first campaign against Llywelyn in 1277, which resulted in his signing of the Aberconwy Treaty. This agreement obliged Llywelyn to pay tribute and restricted Welsh independence to Edward. Tensions were still high, though. Llywelyn revolted against English control once more in 1282. Llywelyn was killed in battle as a result of Edward's overwhelming army response, which also caused the Welsh resistance to crumble. But Edward didn't confine himself to the military victory. By constructing several magnificent castles, he aimed to solidify English control over Wales. He built the so-called Ring of Iron, a system of powerful castles. Castles like Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech were part of the Ring of Iron, which was intended to terrify and subjugate the Welsh populace. The castle's enormous walls, well-positioned towers, and sophisticated defenses made them cutting edge for the era. They still stand today as evidence of Edward's ambition and served as a symbol of his power. 5. He established the first parliamentary model. Edward I established what became known as the Model in 1295, marking a major step in determining the direction of English governance going forward. Parliament. Edward's model parliament was the first to include delegates from all around the kingdom, including knights, clergy, and commoners, in contrast to earlier English kings who had called councils of nobility and clergy to advise them. Edward convened this meeting in order to obtain funds for his conflicts in Scotland and Wales. By include people from many socio-economic classes in the political process, he sought to reinforce royal authority and justify his taxation requirements. Power. The model parliament was important because it signaled the start of a more inclusive political structure. Alongside the church and nobility, his new system gave the general populace a voice, although a little one. Edward was able to solidify his power with this move, because the authority of the strong barons, who had frequently resisted royal policy, was diminished by the admission of knights and commoners. The model parliament established the foundation for the growth of the English parliament as a representative body, despite the fact that it was by no means a democracy. Developing into the current system. 6. The Eleanor Crosses legend. Edward's intense love for Eleanor of Castile, his first wife, was another romantic and moving feature of his rule. In addition to becoming Edward's queen, Eleanor was his devoted friend throughout his several military operations. By all accounts, the couple's relationship was one of respect and affection, and they were married in 1254. In 1290, Eleanor passed away, and Edward was heartbroken. He commissioned the erection of 12 colossal crosses, called the Eleanor Crosses, to commemorate her memory and mark the last resting sites of her burial procession as it made its way from Lincoln to Westminster Abbey. At every halt, these crosses were positioned where, during the trip, Eleanor's body lay there, publicly expressing Edward's love and sorrow. The most well-known of these crosses was placed at London's Charing Cross, which rose to prominence. Landmark. Despite the loss of many of the original crosses, their legacy lives on. They serve as reminders of Edward's unwavering devotion to his wife. Edward is humanized by this gesture of devotion, which reveals a different side of the monarch who is notorious for his brutality in combat. 7. Edward I tried to bring Scotland and England together. Edward I aimed to subjugate Scotland to the English in addition to conquering Wales. Following the death of King Alexander III of Scotland in 1286, which left the nation without a definite heir, he became involved in Scottish affairs. The conflict for the Scottish throne was put to Edward's mediation, but he seized the chance to seize control and establish English supremacy. In 1292, a man by the name of John Balliol became King of Scotland, and Edward backed his claim. Balliol's reign, however, was brief, since Edward promptly weakened his position of power and treated him more like a servant than a sovereign. In Scotland, this caused a great deal of resentment. In 1296, Balliol rebelled against Edward's authority. Edward retaliated violently, defeating Balliol and claiming to be the King of Scotland. Edward tried to dominate Scotland, but it was difficult. Opposition to English domination continued under leaders such as Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. During his lifetime, Edward's vision of bringing England and Scotland together under a single monarchy would not come to pass. However, long after his passing, the Scots persisted in their struggle for independence. 8. While traveling to Scotland, Edward I passed away. In the last years of his reign, Edward's health started to deteriorate, but his resolve to conquer Scotland did not. In 1307, Sands killed Edward at Birr while he was getting ready for another battle against the Scots, close to the Scottish border. That he perished while pursuing a conquest that he worked so hard to achieve feels appropriate. Although an age came to an end with his passing, his reputation as a warrior king lived on. Legend has it that Edward's final request was to have his body boiled and his bones carried into combat with the Scots, allowing him to fight until the end. Although this gory request, which was never granted, is indicative of Edward's steadfast dedication to his military battles and his aim to establish English supremacy over Scotland. Although he succeeded his father, Edward II lacked his father's military prowess and tenacity. Scotland would finally become independent under Edward II, solidifying Edward I's reputation as the fabled but ultimately ineffective Hammer of the Scots. Edward I was ultimately a formidable and multifaceted character in medieval history. Primarily renowned for his military victories and legislative changes, he had a profound effect on England and the surrounding